There are moments inside the royal family that the public gets to watch in full view. The balcony waves, the state banquets, the carefully staged photographs, the polished speeches, the ceremonies designed to be remembered. And then there are the moments no one is supposed to see. The quiet ones, the private decisions, the shifts in power that are never announced outright, but somehow change everything anyway. And according to growing whispers around the palace, that may be exactly what just happened. Because if these reports are even half true, then King Charles has made one of the boldest moves of his reign. Not with Parliament, not with a televised address, not with a constitutional decree, but in private, in silence, in a room where every detail supposedly carried meaning. And what stunned those present wasn't just that the king acted, it was who he appeared to elevate. Not William, Catherine. Before we go further, if you follow royal stories that go deeper than the headlines, subscribe and stay close, because this one is less about official announcements and more about what the palace may already understand behind closed doors. So let's start with the detail that has people talking. The story, as it's being described, centers on a small and unusually private gathering. No public schedule, no camera crews waiting outside, no advance notice to the press, no formal palace statement released afterward. Just a carefully limited room, a select group of senior figures, and an atmosphere that reportedly felt heavier than anyone expected. That alone is unusual. The modern monarchy documents almost everything. Even minor appearances are announced, photographed, archived, and distributed. So when something meaningful happens in complete privacy, people notice. And when that privacy is paired with symbolism, the speculation only grows louder. Because the most striking detail is this: there was said to be a second ceremonial crown present in the room, not displayed for public pageantry, not introduced as part of any official state function, just present, quietly, deliberately. And if that detail is accurate, it changes the emotional temperature of the entire story. A crown, in royal culture, is never just an object. It represents burden, duty, continuity, legitimacy, expectation, history, the weight of the institution itself. And that is why this alleged gesture matters. Because the claim isn't that Charles changed the law. He didn't. William remains the heir. The line of succession remains untouched. No constitutional order has been overturned. No throne has been reassigned. That isn't what makes this story so explosive. What makes it explosive is the idea that Charles may have done something more subtle, and in some ways, more powerful. He may have signaled who he believes already carries the monarchy in the public imagination. And more, that person seems to be Catherine. That is the real story here. Not legal leadership, perceived leadership, not succession on paper, authority in the hearts of the public. And if you think that distinction doesn't matter, then you probably don't understand how monarchy survives in the modern world. Because the British monarchy no longer rules through direct power. It survives through symbolism, continuity, discipline, and public emotional trust. It has to feel stable. It has to feel relevant. It has to feel human enough to remain loved and distant enough to remain regal. That balance is almost impossible to maintain. And right now, the one person who seems to strike that balance better than anyone else is Catherine. That didn't happen overnight. For years, Catherine was often described in safe, predictable language. Elegant, composed, dependable, photogenic, appropriate. The kind of royal description that sounds positive but keeps the person slightly flat. A perfect image, but not always a vivid emotional presence. Then everything changed. Her health crisis changed how the public saw her. Suddenly, she was no longer just the polished Princess of Wales. She became something more relatable, more fragile, more real, and paradoxically, more powerful. When she stepped back from public life, there was confusion, then worry, then an avalanche of public concern, unlike anything the royal family had seen in years. And when she finally spoke openly about what she was facing, the response was immediate. People weren't simply curious anymore. They were emotionally invested. That kind of reaction cannot be manufactured. Public relations teams can shape headlines, they can manage optics, they can schedule appearances and soften controversies, but they cannot force millions of people to feel protective over someone. They cannot create genuine emotional loyalty on command. Either the bond exists or it doesn't. And Catherine's bond with the public, especially after her health struggle, became impossible to ignore. Charles would have seen that more clearly than anyone, because while Catherine was fighting her own battle, Charles was confronting his own health reality too. And health changes how leaders think. It sharpens the question of legacy. It compresses time. It forces decisions that might otherwise have waited years. A monarch dealing with illness does not just think about surviving the next treatment cycle. He thinks about the institution. He thinks about what holds if he weakens. He thinks about which figures reassure the public when the future feels uncertain. And that may be exactly why this supposed ceremony carries so much meaning. If Charles did bring Catherine into a private symbolic moment, then perhaps it was not an act of rebellion against William at all. Perhaps it was an act of recognition. Acknowledgement. A deeply personal statement that in a fragile era, the monarchy needs more than an heir. It needs a stabilizer, a unifying face, a figure people instinctively trust. And right now, that face may not be Charles. It may not even be William. It may be Catherine. That is the part that turns this from gossip into a genuinely fascinating royal story, because William's place is secure in law. Nobody serious disputes that. But monarchy is not run only by legal diagrams. It is sustained by emotional hierarchy too, and emotional hierarchy is harder to define. It emerges from crowds, from public reaction, from silence, from sympathy, from perception, from instinct. It comes from the person people look at when things feel uncertain. Who calms the room? Who softens the institution? Who makes the monarchy feel less like an ancient machine and more like a living family? Over the past few years, Catherine has increasingly become that person. And if Charles has recognized that privately, it would explain a lot. It would explain why her public role has gradually expanded such careful, deliberate ways. It would explain why each return to public life has been handled with unusual gravity. It would explain why moments that might have seemed minor on paper ended up feeling symbolically oversized. Because perhaps they were not isolated appearances at all. Perhaps they were steps in a slow repositioning. Not toward the throne, toward centrality. That is a different kind of ascent. And in some ways, the harder one. Because anyone can inherit a title. Few can become indispensable to the emotional life of an institution. Think about the monarchy's recent history. Queen Elizabeth II provided constancy for so long that people forgot how unusual that level of symbolic steadiness really was. Her presence was the institution. Even critics of monarchy understood the force of her consistency. When she died, the crown didn't just lose a sovereign, it lost its emotional anchor. Charles inherited the throne, but he also inherited that absence. And that is a far more difficult inheritance than a crown. He stepped into a role shaped by decades of expectation, while carrying his own history, his own critics, and eventually his own health concerns. He could preserve form, he could uphold duty, he could command respect. But filling the emotional vacuum left by Elizabeth was always going to be harder. This is where Catherine matters. She doesn't resemble Elizabeth in style, and she doesn't resemble Diana in temperament, but she occupies an unusual middle ground between those two royal legacies. She has some of Elizabeth's steadiness and some of Diana's public magnetism, without appearing to imitate either of them. That combination is rare. It makes her useful to the institution in a way that goes beyond appearances or ceremony. And if Charles has realized that Catherine may be the monarchy's most trusted emotional asset, then a symbolic act centered on her starts to make strategic sense. Even William's role becomes more interesting through that lens. Because the title framing suggests shock. It suggests William was somehow blindsided. Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. But the more compelling interpretation is not that Charles humiliated his son. It is that Charles may have acknowledged a truth William himself already knows. Catherine amplifies the future of the crown in a way no advisor can replicate and no institution can manufacture. That would not necessarily weaken William. It could in fact strengthen him. Because modern royal partnerships matter. The strongest public royal figures are often not strong in isolation. They are strong because the pairing works, the balance works, the image works, the trust works. William may represent continuity, inheritance, and direct legitimacy. Catherine may represent warmth, reassurance, and emotional legitimacy. Put those two forms of legitimacy together, and the monarchy becomes more survivable. Split them, and the institution feels colder. So if Charles truly staged a moment that centered Catherine, It may not have been a rejection of William. It may have been a message to the inner circle. Understand what she is to this family. Understand what she is to this crown, and do not underestimate the role she already plays. That is a powerful message, especially because it comes at a time when the monarchy cannot afford confusion about relevance. Public institutions survive partly by law and partly by feeling. The law can keep a system standing long after affection begins to fade, but affection determines whether the public still cares. And when people stop caring, even the most decorated institutions begin to look ceremonial in the worst sense of the word, empty. Catherine prevents that emptiness. She gives the monarchy texture. She gives it tenderness without making it weak. She gives it discipline without making it icy. That balance is part of why even small moments involving her often travel so far. A hospital visit, a brief exchange with a child, a quiet smile, a measured public update. Time and again, the public reads these moments not as performance, but as evidence of character. Whether that perception is fully fair is almost beside the point. In monarchy, perception is substance, and Charles, perhaps more than anyone, understands that now. Which brings us back to the alleged secret ceremony itself. What if the real importance of that room was not what was said, but what was understood? What if nobody needed a speech because the symbolism was enough? A second crown, a private audience, a carefully restricted setting, a gesture directed not toward the heir, but toward the woman beside the future king. That is not how you rewrite the Constitution. That is how you rewrite the internal narrative. You tell the people closest to power that the monarchy's center of gravity has shifted, not legally, not formally, but unmistakably. And that would explain why the reaction described around the story is not outrage so much as stunned recognition. Because for many royal watchers, the claim does not feel random. It feels like the dramatic expression of something already visible in public life. Catherine has, slowly but unmistakably, become the figure through whom many people process the monarchy emotionally. She is the reassuring image after turmoil, the human face after institutional distance, the calm presence when headlines turn chaotic. That kind of role cannot remain unofficial forever. At some point, even private royal culture would have to respond to it. And maybe it already has. One of the most interesting dimensions of this entire story is that it blurs the line between ceremony and signal. Royal history is full of gestures whose power far exceeded their legal function. Seats at tables, order of entrance, placement on balconies, titles granted at specific moments, patronages transferred quietly, who is seen, who is not. In monarchy, choreography is language. So if Catherine was indeed singled out in a room like this, the meaning may have been understood immediately by everyone present. Not because a law changed, but because royal symbolism is designed precisely for moments when saying less means more. And that may be why the story has landed so hard. Because it suggests Charles has reached a conclusion that the public reached earlier, that Catherine is no longer simply preparing for the future. She is already helping hold the present together. That is what makes the title feel so potent. Real leader does not have to mean ruler. It can mean focal point. It can mean emotional center. It can mean the person who most effectively carries the institution's dignity into a media age that punishes stiffness and distrusts performance. And if that is the definition, then yes, Catherine's claim is stronger than many people are comfortable admitting. It is also why the supposed shock to William matters so much in headline form. Because headlines need conflict. They need a displaced figure, a dramatic reversal, an upset expectation. But the deeper royal truth may be more complicated and, in its own way, more profound. This may not be about William losing standing. It may be about Catherine gaining historical weight. There is a difference, a huge one. And Charles, if he really orchestrated this moment, may have wanted that difference understood. He may have wanted insiders to stop treating Catherine as a future accessory to the crown and start treating her as one of the crown's current pillars. Not tomorrow. Not when William ascends. Now. That is a serious reclassification. It changes how responsibilities are interpreted. It changes how appearances are read. It changes how advisors plan. It changes how the public story of the monarchy develops over the next decade. And it may also reveal something deeply personal about Charles himself. Because kings do not only preserve institutions, they interpret them. They decide which qualities matter most at a given moment in history: strength, stability, visibility, compassion, tradition, modernization. Every monarch, whether openly or quietly, makes those choices. And Charles may have decided that the monarchy's survival in this phase depends less on grandeur and more on trust. If so, Catherine is the obvious bet. Not because she is flashy, not because she is loud, not because she dominates the room in the modern celebrity sense, but because she does something much rarer. She lowers the temperature. She makes the institution breathe. She turns spectacle into reassurance. For a monarchy navigating illness, succession anxiety, and constant public scrutiny, that may be more valuable than almost anything else. So was there really a secret crown ceremony? Was there truly a private gesture so loaded that it left the room silent? At this point, the hardest part of the story to verify is the part that matters most. But even if some details have been dramatized in the retelling, the emotional logic behind the story remains powerful for a reason. It fits the moment. It fits the personalities. It fits the trajectory the public has already been watching in real time. And maybe that is why this story refuses to die. Because whether or not every detail happened exactly as described, the larger idea feels believable. Charles may have recognized that the monarchy's most effective source of present-day trust is not the king himself, and not even the future king alone, but the woman standing at the center of its emotional renewal. Catherine, the one who endured, the one who returned, the one the public never stopped watching, the one whose quietness somehow became influence. If Charles has truly chosen to mark that in private, then history may eventually remember it as one of the most intelligent symbolic moves of his reign. Not because it altered succession, but because it acknowledged reality before the rest of the system was ready to say it out loud. And maybe that is the real shock. Not that Charles saw Catherine's power, but that he decided everyone else in that room needed to see it too.